The day I came home after a 16-hour shift in the emergency room and found my daughter's bedroom nearly empty, with the star stickers we had put on the wall together still there but her bed, her desk, and her clothes completely gone. The first thing I did was stand in the doorway unable to move my feet, and the second thing I did was walk to the living room where my mother, my father, and my sister were sitting as if nothing had happened, and asked them where Isabella was. And my mother told me, with the specific calm of someone who has rehearsed this conversation, that Isabella was with her father and that the room was needed for my sister Diana's recording studio. And when I told them no one had consulted me about any of this, my father looked up from the television and told me I had no say in the decisions of this house because I was never here. And in that moment something inside me that had been holding itself together for years decided it was not going to hold together anymore. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, quiet justice, and people who discover too late that actions have consequences, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because we share stories like this every day. My name is Andrea. I am 34 years old. I am an emergency room nurse at a public hospital, and for the last 4 years I have worked double shifts, overnight shifts, holiday shifts, and shifts none of my colleagues wanted to cover, not because I enjoyed spending 16 hours on my feet under artificial light while the world outside slept, but because I had a mortgage payment due punctually every month on a loan I had signed for years earlier at my parents' explicit request when their bank threatened to foreclose on the family property because they did not have the credit profile to refinance it, and I had signed because I am their daughter and because at the time I believed, with the specific naivety of someone who has not yet learned to read certain family contracts, that signing that paper was an act of love rather than the beginning of a silent transfer of power that for years later would leave me standing in the doorway of my daughter's empty bedroom wondering how I had gotten here. The property was a 3-bedroom house in a middle-class neighborhood in the city, a house my grandparents had built decades ago and that my parents had inherited and lived in their entire adult lives, and that over time and through my father's financial decisions, which reflected a genuine generosity but an economic discipline that could be described politely as inconsistent, had accumulated 2 refinancing cycles, a debt to a private lender charging interest rates I prefer not to describe here because remembering them produces a physical indignation in me, and finally a crisis situation in which the bank had sent a letter notifying that it would begin foreclosure proceedings in 90 days if the outstanding balance was not resolved, and it was at that point, 4 years ago, that my parents called me to a meeting at the kitchen table of that same house, explained the situation, and asked me to put my name on the loan, to use my clean credit history to refinance the total debt, and to put the property in my name as collateral for the new loan because the bank required it to approve the transaction. I was 30 years old at that time, Isabella was 3, and I had been separated for 2 years from Marcus, my daughter's father, a man who was not unkind but who had demonstrated consistently that active fatherhood and financial responsibility were concepts he understood in theory but applied selectively and conveniently, and who during that period paid child support with a punctuality that depended directly on how many other pressures he was facing that month, which meant I had learned to build a budget that did not depend on him to function, and that budget was tight but it worked, and part of why it worked was that I did not pay rent because I lived in the family house, and that advantage disappeared completely the day I signed the loan because from that point forward the monthly mortgage payment became my responsibility, and my parents contributed what they could, which some months was a reasonable amount, and other months was a phone call explaining that things were tight. Diana, my sister, is 27 years old and since she was 19 has pursued a sequence of creative projects that my parents have supported with a consistency and enthusiasm that contrasts notably with how they processed my decision to study nursing, which they described at the time as a safe career but without a future. Ian Diana's projects had included a vintage clothing shop that lasted 8 months, a cooking YouTube channel that published 11 videos over 2 years, a line of artisanal candles sold primarily to family members, and now, apparently, a music career requiring a professional recording studio installed in the bedroom where my 7-year-old daughter slept, and no one in that house had considered it necessary to consult me, or Isabella, before making that decision. What my father had told me that night, that I had no say in the decisions of this house because I was never here, was a sentence that contained an injustice so specific and so perfectly constructed that it took me several minutes to be able to respond, because the reason I was never here was precisely the work that was paying the mortgage on that house, the double shifts, the holidays, the New Year's nights in the emergency room while my family slept or celebrated. All of that had been there. Price of keeping a roof over the heads of the very people who were now telling me that my absence disqualified me from having an opinion about what happened under that roof. And that construction, that way of using my sacrifice as an argument against me, was something I needed a few days to fully process before deciding what to do with it. What I decided to do, after 3 days during which I went to find Isabella at Marcus's house, held her for a length of time that probably seemed excessive to a 7-year-old but that felt barely sufficient to me, and sat her on the guest room bed and explained that her room at the grandparents' house was being reorganized but that I was working on getting her space back, was to go to the drawer of my desk in the bedroom I occupied in the family house, take out the blue folder where I kept all the documents related to the mortgage, the property deed, the refinancing contract, and 4 years of monthly payment receipts, and sit down to read them with the specific attention of someone who for the first time in a long time is reading a contract not as an act of love but as a legal document that defines rights and obligations. What I found in that blue folder when I read it with the eyes of an adult who understands what she is reading rather than the eyes of a daughter who signed because her family needed her to, was something I had known in the abstract but had never processed in its complete practical implications, which was that the property was deeded exclusively in my name, that I was the only registered title holder, that the mortgage was in my name, and I was the only party obligated to the bank, and that none of those documents mentioned my parents or my sister in any legally relevant capacity, which meant that the house where my family had lived their entire lives and where they were now installing a recording studio without consulting me was, in every available legal term, my house, and that my father's phrase, "You have no say in the decisions of this house," was a sentence that could only be sustained if everyone agreed to collectively ignore the fact that technically and legally I was the only person in that house with a binding say over absolutely everything that happened inside it. I called an attorney named Patricia Sandoval that a hospital colleague had recommended to me months earlier for completely different reasons and whom I had never contacted because I had never believed I would need to. And when I explained the situation to her over the phone, she asked me to come to her office with a complete blue folder. And during that 2-hour meeting, Patricia reviewed each document with an attention I found simultaneously reassuring and mildly alarming. Reassuring because someone was finally seeing what I had been looking at alone, and alarming because Patricia's expression while she read was not the expression of someone reviewing an ordinary situation, but of someone identifying the scope of something that could have become complicated in ways that had not yet occurred, but that were available as a possibility. And when she finished reading, she told me that my legal position was extremely solid, that the deed in my name was a document no moral or family argument could overcome in court, and that before making any move I needed to understand exactly what I wanted as an outcome, not only what I wanted to stop happening but what I wanted to exist at the end of all of this. That question, what I wanted to exist at the end of all of this, stayed with me during the 4 days that followed while I continued going to the hospital, doing my shifts, and living in the house with my parents and Diana in a kind of suspended normalcy where no one directly mentioned what had happened but where Isabella's empty room, which Diana had begun filling with audio equipment and acoustic foam panels, was a constant presence that made it impossible to pretend everything was the same. And during those 4 days I also discovered something I had not been looking for but found while reviewing the loan statements to prepare the information Patricia had asked me for, which was that for the past 8 months my parents had stopped making their agreed contribution to the mortgage payment completely silently, without telling me, without explaining, simply stopping their deposits, and that I had covered the full payment those 8 months with my double shifts without noticing their change because my automatic payment system processed it without requiring me to intervene month by month, and that the accumulated difference over 8 months represented a sum I would never have spent on anything else had I known it was available to be spent. I returned to Patricia's office with that additional information and the statements that documented it, and Patricia reviewed them and added a note to her analysis that slightly changed the tone of the conversation, because the failure to honor a contribution agreement, even a verbal one, and even though the formal obligation to the bank was mine, established a pattern of behavior that was relevant to any future conversation about the conditions of occupancy of the property, and Patricia explained that I had 3 available paths. The first was a direct conversation with my parents where I presented the documents and established clear conditions for continuing to cohabit. The second was a formal letter from her as my legal representative establishing those conditions in writing with specific consequences if they were not met. And the third was initiating the process of recovering Isabella's space and establishing the rules of the property in a formal way without prior negotiation. And she told me that the decision of which path to choose depended entirely on what I knew about my family and what I believed each path would produce as a real outcome. The answer to that question arrived in a way I had not anticipated, which was a conversation I overheard unintentionally on Wednesday afternoon when I arrived home from the hospital 40 minutes earlier than expected and found my mother and Diana in the kitchen talking quietly enough not to be heard from the entrance but loudly enough to be heard from the hallway. And what I heard was Diana telling my mother that Andrea is never going to do anything because she can't throw her own parents out of their house. And my mother responding that Andrea is very hardworking but very soft. She's always been that way. And Diana saying that she had measured the room and a vocal booth fit perfectly if they removed the built-in closet. And my mother saying that could be done the following weekend. And I stood in the hallway for approximately 20 seconds processing what I had just heard, and then went to my room, closed the door, took out my phone, and wrote to Patricia that I was ready for the second path. The letter Patricia sent to my parents arrived on a Tuesday morning by certified mail with return receipt, and I was at the hospital when it arrived, but my mother called me 17 minutes after the mail carrier knocked on the door, and what I heard when I answered was not the voice of someone who was surprised but the voice of someone who was frightened. Which is an important difference because fear implies that on some level the person calling knows that what is happening has real consequences, and my mother said my name 3 times before saying anything else, and then said that a letter from a lawyer had arrived and that she did not understand what any of this was about and hoped I would explain what was happening. And I told her that the letter was quite clear and that Patricia was available to answer any technical questions. And I ended the call because I had a patient waiting, and because I had nothing further to add at that moment. Patricia's letter established 4 points in terms that permitted no ambiguity. The first was that the property at that address was registered exclusively in the name of Andrea Montoya. The second was that any structural or use modification to spaces within the property required the express written consent of the title holder. The third was that the space known as the secondary bedroom, which had been the room of the minor Isabella Montoya for the past 4 years, was to be restored to its original condition within no more than 15 calendar days from receipt of the letter, and the fourth was that the verbally agreed contribution toward the mortgage payment, whose non-fulfillment over 8 months was documented in the attached statements, was to be regularized within 30 days or the formal process of establishing cohabitation conditions through notarial instrument would be initiated. My father called me that same afternoon, and unlike my mother, who had sounded frightened, my father sounded angry with that specific anger of men accustomed to having their moral authority go unquestioned by documents, and he told me I was destroying the family over a bedroom, and that he never would have expected this from me, and that what I was doing was disrespectful to everything they had built. And I listened to him completely without interrupting because Patricia had told me to do exactly that, to let the other side exhaust their emotional arguments before responding. And when he finished I told him 3 things. The first was that the bedroom was not the issue, that the issue was that they had made a decision about my 7-year-old daughter's space without consulting me and had told me I had no say in my own house. The second was that everything they had built had been registered in my name for 4 years, and that registration existed because they had asked me for it when the bank was about to foreclose. And the third was that I did not want to destroy anything, that I wanted things to be clear, and that if things were clear we could continue living together without anyone having to guess what the rules were. And my father did not respond immediately, and that silence was the first sign that something had shifted. Diana was the most difficult, not because she had stronger arguments but because she had more emotional energy available for conflict, and for the 3 days following the letter she sent me messages ranging from accusation to grievance and back to accusation. That I was selfish, that I had always wanted control over the family, that the studio was her dream and I was destroying it, that Isabella was fine with her father and I was overreacting, and I saved every message in a folder on my phone. And did not respond to any of them individually, but sent her a single message on the 4th day saying that the 15-day deadline to restore Isabella's bedroom was running from the date of receipt of the letter, and that Patricia was available if she had questions about the process. And I did not respond to anything further from her that week. Isabella's bedroom was restored in 12 days, 2 days before the deadline, and I did not ask how or with whose help because it was not information I needed. I only needed the result. And when I walked into the room and saw that the bed was back and the desk was back and the star stickers was still on the wall where we had put them together, I went to get Isabella from Marcus's house and brought her back that same weekend. And when she walked into her room and saw it the same as always and asked me why she had been at her dad's house so many days, I told her there had been some work done in the house but that everything was ready now. And Isabella said, "Oh, with the verbal economy of children who need no more explanation than the one that confirms their world is in order." And that single syllable was one of the most important things I heard during that entire period. What happened in the weeks that followed was a process I would describe as a silent renegotiation of the terms of cohabitation, not because anyone named it that way but because that was how it felt in practice. My parents resumed their contribution to the mortgage without anyone having to ask a second time, and with a punctuality that contrasted notably with the previous 8 months. Diana installed her audio equipment in her own bedroom with professional headphones instead of speakers, which technically resolved the sound issue that had supposedly made the studio necessary, and the conversations at the kitchen table acquired a different quality, not necessarily warmer but more honest, as if everyone had stopped pretending that the rules were different from what the documents said they were. My father said something to me 3 weeks after all of this that I had not expected and that I am not entirely sure how to interpret even now. He said it one morning while the two of us were having coffee before I left for the hospital and he left for his workshop. He told me that when he was young his own father had told him that a family is the place where you can be completely yourself, and that with time he had come to understand that this was true, but that being completely yourself sometimes included making mistakes in ways that affected the people you loved most, and that he believed he had made a mistake. He did not say in what specifically. He did not use the words Isabella's bedroom or the lawyer's letter or the 8 months without paying. He only said he believed he had made a mistake, and I told him that yes, that I had also made mistakes in some things, that I had waited too long to have conversations I should have had earlier, and we were both quiet for a moment, and then he left for his workshop and I left for the hospital and neither of us mentioned it again. And I do not know whether that is the end of something or the beginning of something different, but I know that Isabella that night slept in her room with her star stickers and asked me to read 2 chapters instead of 1, and I read her 3 because I could, and that was enough. What I learned from all of this has to do with a specific trap that many people who love their families fall into, which is confusing love with the surrender of rights, and believing that protecting what is yours is an act of selfishness rather than an act of clarity, and that the people who benefit from that confusion do not always do so with calculated malice but sometimes simply with the comfort of those who have never had to examine the assumptions on which that comfort rests, and that their moment those assumptions become visible does not have to be the end of a family but the beginning of a more honest relationship, as long as there is something real beneath the assumptions worth preserving. And in my case there was, and in yours there may be too, and the only way to know is to have the conversation with the documents on the table and see what remains when the comfort can no longer sustain itself alone.